The high plains of the Wyoming Territory were a line drawn in dust, separating the sky from a burnt, thirsty earth. At the outpost, which was nothing more than a sod-built saloon and a leaning trading post, the wind never stopped. It blew grit into men's eyes and patience out of their souls. It was here, under a white, unforgiving sun, that Jedediah packed Clara's small bundle. He did not look at her. His hands, thick and shaking, fumbled with the rope tie. "He's a good man. Clara, a cattleman. Got prospects," Jed muttered, his voice raspy with whiskey and lies. Clara stood still. She was 19 years old, and she knew her father was selling her. The word had not been spoken, but it hung in the air, thick as the smell of the unwashed men staring from the saloon's shaded porch. The man, Silas Croft, leaned against a hitching post. He was not old, but he was worn hard, like a boot heel ground down on rock. His eyes were small and pale, and they moved over Clara as if she were livestock. "4 horses. Jed, that was the deal," Croft said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. His voice was flat. "They're good stock," Jed stammered, his gaze fixed on the animals in question. 4 mares, sturdy and strong, replacements for the team he had lost in a fool's blizzard last spring. He had cried over those dead animals. He did not cry now. "She can cook?" Croft asked, his eyes still on Clara. "She can cook. She can clean. Men's. She's strong," Jed said, finally pushing the small bundle into Clara's hands. Clara's own hands were numb. She looked at her father, at the desperation that had hollowed him out, leaving only the craving for whiskey and the shame that fed it. She wanted to scream. She wanted to beg. But the part of her that knew how to beg had been silenced long ago. She had learned the hard way. That noise only earned a cuff from his heavy hand. "Get your things on his wagon," Jed commanded, turning away. The transaction was complete. Clara looked at the mares. They were beautiful, with coats that shone in the harsh light. They were worth more than she was. She felt a cold, hollowing emptiness. She was property. She walked to Silas Croft's wagon, her legs stiff, and placed her bundle in the back. She did not look back at her father as Croft mounted his horse, tied a lead rope from her wagon to his saddle horn, and pulled them both out of the outpost and into the vast, indifferent wilderness. The shack was miles from anything, hidden in a shallow, rocky canyon that trapped the heat. It was 2 rooms, built of raw pine and mud chinking, with a dirt floor and a smell of old grease and sour linens. This was her new home. Silas Croft dropped her bundle on the floor. "Stove's there, water's in the barrel. I like supper at sundown. Don't waste firewood." He left, riding out to check on the cattle he grazed in the hills. Clara was left alone in the suffocating silence. She looked around the small, filthy space. A rickety table, 2 stools, a stained mattress in the corner of the main room, another small, dark room off the back. She was a possession, and this was her cage. For weeks, she fell into a rhythm of mute servitude. She rose before the sun, grinding coffee and frying salt pork. She scrubbed Croft's clothes on a washboard until her knuckles were raw. She swept the dirt floor, hauled water from the silty creek, and baked dents. Dry bread. She cooked, she cleaned, and she tried to make herself invisible. Croft spoke to her not as a person, but as a tool that was not working to his satisfaction. "This coffee's thin. You missed a spot on that shirt. You're slow today." The worst times were at night. He would sit at the table, sharpening his knife or cleaning his rifle, his pale eyes fixed on her. He would talk, his voice a low rumble, telling her how he'd been cheated in the deal. 4 good horses, he'd say, shaking his head. "And for what? A scrawny, silent thing. Jed saw me coming. Should have only given him 2. He would look at her, a speculative, cold smile touching his lips. "But maybe I'll get my money's worth yet. You're young, just need breaking in, like a filly." Clara would lower her head, her hair falling forward to hide her face, and her stomach would knot into a tight, cold ball of fear. She felt her sense of self, the small, private core of who she was, beginning to chip away. She was not Clara. She was it. She was the girl. She was the price of 4 horses. Her very personhood was fraying, becoming as thin and worn as the rags she used to clean his skillet. She began to forget the sound of her own voice. The rain started just after dusk, a cold, miserable slant against the thin plank walls. It was a late autumn storm, and it carried the first bite of winter. Inside the shack, the air was thick. Croft had been drinking. The jug of cheap whiskey was half empty on the table. He had not eaten the supper she'd made. He just watched her. Clara cleaned the plates, her movements quick and nervous. The sound of the rain was a roar, but the silence inside the cabin was louder. "Stop that," he said. Clara froze, her hands in the greasy dishwater. "Come here." She turned slowly. He was standing, his bulk filling the small room. The look in his eyes was not the flat, cold assessment she was used to. It was something else, something heavy and hungry. "I paid for you," he said, taking a step toward her. "Paid good. Time I collected." "No," she whispered. The word was a puff of air, barely audible. "No?" He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You don't get to say no. You're mine." He lunged for her. Clara reacted without thinking. The fear that had paralyzed her for weeks turned brittle and snapped. She threw the pan of dirty water at his face. He bellowed, sputtering, and she ran for the door. He caught her by the arm, his fingers like a steel trap. He grabbed a length of rope from a peg by the door. He was strong, and her desperation was no match for his brute strength. He twisted her arm, binding her wrists together, the rough hemp biting deep into her skin. "You'll learn," he snarled, shoving her toward the small back room. "You'll learn what you are." He pushed her inside. She stumbled, falling to the dirt floor. He was fumbling with the door, intending to bar it, but in his drunken rage, he knocked over the small stool he meant to use as a brace. He swore, turning back to the main room to grab something heavier. In that second, Clara saw it. The back wall of the small room was poorly built. A few boards were loose, shoved aside where rats had burrowed through. It was not a window. It was just a gap. She scrambled, pulling at the boards. They gave way with a splintering sound. She heard him roar her name from the other room. She did not hesitate. She wriggled through the narrow, muddy opening, her ripped shawl catching on a nail. She tore it free and fell out into the driving, ice-cold rain. She ran. Her bare feet slipped and cut on the sharp rocks of the canyon. The rope on her wrists was still tight, the fibers already soaked and burning. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. She ran into the blackness, into the cold, screaming hills, with the sound of his rage lost behind her in the howl of the storm. Eli had made his camp in the lee of a granite outcrop, a place that offered some small protection from the wind, if not the rain. He was a man who knew how to make a camp. His fire was small, hot, and built in a shallow pit that shielded it from the worst of the weather. His bedroll was laid out under a tightly stretched oilcloth, and his 2 horses, a solid bay and a tough little Mustang, were picketed nearby. Heads down, tails to the wind, he was traveling alone. He preferred it that way. Eli had been a scout for the Union, a job that had taught him how to read the land, how to move without being seen, and how to kill without hesitation. The war had ended, but the violence had not. He had tried to settle, tried to work for other men, but the world was too loud, too greedy. He had left it behind, driving a small string of his own cattle, though most had been sold off. Now he was just moving, searching for a piece of country quiet enough to let a man forget the things he had done, and the things that had been done to him. He sat by his fire, nursing a tin cup of coffee, listening to the storm. He was not worried. He had weathered worse. He was thinking of the pass he'd have to cross tomorrow when he heard a sound. It was not a wolf. It was not a coyote. It was the sound of a stone skittering, and a sharp, hitched breath. He was on his feet in an instant. hand moving to the Colt holstered at his hip. He stood away from the firelight, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady. A shape emerged from the rain, a staggering, dark figure that seemed more ghost than person. It stumbled into the barest edge of the firelight, and Eli's hand dropped from his gun. It was a woman, or a girl. He could not tell. She was soaked to the bone, covered in mud. Her dress was ripped, and a tattered shawl hung from one shoulder. Her hair was plastered to her face, and she was shaking so hard he could see it from 10 feet away. She stopped, staring at him, her eyes wide and animal bright with terror. Then she saw his hand near his hip, and she flinched so violently she almost fell. "No!" she choked out. "Please, don't!" Eli raised his hands slowly, palms out, away from his body. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was low and gentle, the tone he used for a spooked horse. He kept his distance. He could see her more clearly now. Her face was bruised, a dark mark swelling on her cheek. Her feet were bare and bloody. And her hands, she was holding them clutched to her chest. They were bound. He felt a cold, familiar anger settle in his gut. He kept his voice calm. "You're safe here. Come by the fire. You're freezing." She didn't move. She just trembled, her gaze darting from him to the dark woods behind her, as if deciding which was the greater danger. "I have a knife," Eli said, speaking slowly, deliberately. "I can cut that rope. You can hold it if you like. I'll just hand it to you." He reached to his belt, pulled his skinning knife from its sheath, and held it out, handle first. Clara stared at the knife, then at his face. He was not Silas. His eyes were not pale and hungry. They were dark and quiet and sad. She took one hesitant step, then another. She reached out with her bound hands and fumbled, her fingers stiff and numb, until she had the knife. "Can you manage it?" he asked. She shook her head, her teeth chattering. She couldn't stop shaking. "All right," he said. I'll go slow." He stepped toward her, one slow pace at a time. She flinched, but she held her ground. He gently took the knife from her, turned her hands over, and slid the blade between her wrists, sharp edge facing away from her skin. With one quick, clean motion, he cut the rope. The 2 severed ends fell away. Clara stared at the raw, red burns on her wrists. The skin was rubbed clean off. She made a small, broken sound in the back of her throat and crumpled, falling to her knees in the mud by his fire. Eli did not touch her. He stepped back, giving her space. He turned to his bedroll, pulled the heavy wool blanket from under the oilcloth, and walked back. He did not wrap it around her. He just laid it gently over her shoulders. Then he went to his saddlebag, pulled out a strip of dried jerky and a piece of hardtack. He poured the last of his coffee into his cup and added a splash of water from his canteen to cool it. He set the food in the cup on the ground near her, close enough to reach, but not so close that he had to lean over her. "Eat," he said, his voice still low. "It's not much, but it's warm." Clara stared at the cup. She grabbed it with both hands, the tin warm against her frozen fingers, and drank. The coffee was bitter and hot, and it burned a trail down to her empty stomach. She picked up the jerky and tore at it, chewing like a starved wolf. Eli watched her for only a moment, just long enough to see that she was eating. He saw the bruise, the rope burns, the terror that hadn't left her eyes. He knew what kind of man did this. He turned his back to her, a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. He walked back to the other side of the fire and sat down on his saddle, facing out into the rain. He gave her the fire, and he gave her his silence. He heard her finish the food. He heard her set the cup down, and then he heard her cry. It was not a loud sound. It was a silent, terrible weeping, the kind that comes after the body has run out of screams. Her shoulders, wrapped in his blanket, shook. Eli did not look. He stayed perfectly still, his back to her, a silent guardian against the storm. He kept his watch, listening to the rain and the sound of a woman breaking, and let her grieve in peace. When Clara woke, the world was a cold, flat gray. The rain had stopped, but the sky was heavy, threatening more. Her first thought was of Silas. She sat up, clutching the blanket, her heart hammering. But there was no shack. There was just the smoking remains of a fire, a granite wall, and the smell of wet earth and horses. The man was gone. She panicked, scrambling to her feet, thinking he had left her. But then she saw him. He was 100 yards away, down by a small creek, watering his horses. He was not gone. He was just away. He had left her his blanket. He had left her by the fire. He had not touched her. The land around her was brutal. The hills were steep, covered in thorn brush and sharp, gray rock. Last night, she had run through this in the dark. She looked at her feet. They were swollen, cut and bruised, caked in dried blood and mud. She heard a howl, distant but clear. A wolf greeting the dreary morning. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter. The wildness of the place was terrifying. It was a land that did not care if you lived or died. But Silas cared. He would want her back. He would be angry. He would hunt her. Still. She looked at the man by the creek. He finished with the horses, coiling his rope. He started walking back toward the camp. He moved slowly, not looking at her, giving her time to see him coming. He was not running. He was not shouting. Clara made a choice. She could run again, try to hide in these barren hills, and surely die of hunger or cold. Or she could stay. She could trust the man who had given her his blanket and turned his back when she cried. She did not run. She sat back down by the fire, her whole body an ache, and waited. Eli walked up, stopping a respectful distance away. "Morning," he said. Clara just nodded. Her throat was too sore to speak. Eli started rebuilding the fire, adding small, dry sticks from a bundle he kept under his oilcloth. He soon had a small, clean flame. He filled his coffee pot from his canteen and set it in the coals. He did not ask her name. He did not ask her where she came from. He did not ask about the rope burns. He just moved with a quiet, efficient grace, packing his few belongings, checking his horse's hooves. When the coffee was hot, he poured her a cup. She took it with trembling hands. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the drip of water from the high rocks. She had to say something. She had to explain. She owed him that. She started. Her voice was a croak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "He traded for me." The words came out, small and ugly. "My father, for horses." She looked down at her hands, at the raw wounds on her wrists. She could not say the rest. She could not talk about Silas or the shack or the terror. She had summed up her entire life in one word. Traded. Eli stopped packing. He stood very still for a long moment, his back to her. She saw his shoulders tense. He turned around slowly. He looked at her, his eyes dark with an anger she realized was not aimed at her. It was an old anger, one he lived with. He looked at her bare, bloody feet. He looked at her bruised face. He took a deep breath. He did not step toward her. He did not offer pity. He offered something harder and better. "Well," he said, his voice flat and final. "Nobody owns you now." Clara looked up at him. It was, she thought, the first true thing anyone had said to her in months. It was a fact. She had run. She was freezing and starved and hurt, but she was not in that shack. She did not belong to Silas Croft. She did not even belong to her father. The wind was cold. The land was cruel. But it was free. And, for this one moment, so was she. They had to move. Eli was not a man to sit still. He had a destination, even if he kept it to himself. He stamped out the fire, packed the last of his gear, and saddled his horses. Clara stood, uncertain. She was weak. Her feet were agony. She could not walk far. Eli finished with his bay, then turned to his Mustang. He looked at her. "I'm heading south, toward Bitter Creek. You can ride." He was offering her his second horse. She stared. It was a kindness so large, She did not know how to accept it. She just nodded. Mute. He helped her mount. He was careful, his hands brushing her arm and back, but only as much as was necessary to get her into the saddle. His touch was firm, impersonal, and safe. He mounted his own horse. "We'll go slow," he said, and he did. He kept his strong bay to a slow, steady walk. The Mustang followed, and Clara clung to the saddle horn, the wool blanket wrapped around her. They moved through the rocky hills, two small figures in a vast, empty landscape. He rode a few feet ahead, but he kept his horse at a pace she could manage, a pace that did not jostle her wounds. They did not talk. There was nothing to say. But as the morning wore on, a strange, fragile thing began to grow in the silence. It was not comfort. It was not friendship. It was a simple, wordless understanding. He had seen her at her worst. He had not hurt her. He had not judged her. He had cut her free, for the first time in her life. Clara was traveling with a man she was not afraid of, a fragile trust, as thin and pale as the watery morning sun, began to grow. They traveled south for 2 days, moving through a country of high, broken mesas and deep, dry arroyos. Eli kept the pace slow. Clara's feet, though healing, were still a map of raw cuts and deep bruises. Riding the Mustang was a blessing, but every jolt sent a fresh ache through her body. Eli remained quiet, a steady presence just ahead of her. He spoke only when necessary. "Water the horse here. We camp high tonight. Watch for snakes." His silence was a strange comfort. It was not the angry, brooding silence of her father, nor the cold, assessing silence of Silas Croft. It was just quiet. It was the silence of the land itself, watchful and patient. Clara found herself listening to the sound of the wind, the cry of a hawk, the clop of the horse's hooves on the rock. She had not realized how long it had been since she had heard anything but the sound of her own fear. On the 3rd morning, they crested a ridge and Eli pulled his horse to a stop. He pointed. Bitter Creek, in the valley below. A scattering of raw plank buildings and dirty tents huddled along a muddy track. A plume of black smoke rose from a tall chimney, staining the clean, cold air. It was a mining town, raw and hurried, a scar on the face of the wilderness. As they rode down the switchback trail, Clara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. A town meant people. It meant men. She pulled the wool blanket tighter, hiding her ripped dress, her bound hair, and the dark, fading bruises on her face. She was keenly aware of the rope burns on her wrists, red and ugly. The main street was a river of mud. Miners in filth-caked denim, teamsters, and rough-looking men in trail dust watched them pass. Every stare felt like a physical touch, a violation. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the back of Eli's hat. She felt naked, exposed, a piece of damaged goods on display. Eli seemed oblivious to the stares. He moved with a purpose, his gaze level, missing nothing. He dismounted in front of a long building with a painted sign, Mercantile Provisions. He tied his horse, then walked back to help her down from the Mustang. His hands were gentle on her waist as he lifted her, but she still flinched, her body tensing. He let go instantly, stepping back. "Wait here," he said, and went inside. Clara stood by the horses, trying to make herself small. Men walking past slowed down, their eyes lingering. One man, bearded and smelling of sour whiskey, tipped his hat. "Morning, miss, you look a little lost." Clara shrank back against the Mustang, her heart pounding. The door of the Mercantile opened, and Eli was there. He did not look at the man. He just stood in the doorway, a solid, unmoving presence, and the man's smile faltered. He muttered something and moved on. Eli turned back into the store. "Come on!" Clara hurried inside, grateful for the escape. The store was dim, smelling of coffee beans, leather, and smoked bacon. A weary-looking man with spectacles stood behind a long counter. Eli had unstrapped a heavy roll of gear from his saddle. He unrolled it on the counter. A fine, braided lariat, A set of branding irons with a symbol she did not recognize. A heavy, silver-inlaid bit. They were beautiful, tools of a man's trade, his livelihood. "What can I do for you, mister?" the storekeeper asked. "I need to trade," Eli said. He pushed the lariat forward. "What will this get me?" The man picked it up, testing its weight and balance. "Good rope, worth, say, $10 credit." "I need a dress," Eli said, gesturing toward Clara. "One that fits, and boots, and stockings, something warm." The storekeeper's gaze flicked to Clara. He took in her ruined clothes, her bare feet tucked into stirrups. His expression was not unkind, just tired. He had seen this story before. "Got some ready-mades in the back," he said. He returned with a dress of dark blue wool, simple and sturdy, with a plain white collar. He held it up. It looked clean. It looked whole. "And boots," Eli said, pointing to a row on the shelf. "Size 7, I'd guess." They settled on a pair of sturdy leather boots, built for walking, not for show. Eli added 2 pairs of thick woolen stockings. The storekeeper tallied the cost. "That's $8.50. We need supplies," Eli said. He used the remaining credit and some coins from a small leather pouch to buy flour, salt, bacon, coffee, and a small tin of salve. The storekeeper wrapped the clothes and boots in brown paper. Eli packed the supplies into his saddlebags. Clara just stood, her hands clenched, watching him trade away pieces of his life for her. He handed her the parcel. "There's a livery stable at the end of the street. You can change in an empty stall." She took the package. It was heavy. You didn't have to," she whispered. "You need clothes," he said, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. He turned and left the store. In the dusty, dim light of an empty stall, surrounded by the smell of hay and manure, Clara untied the string. She ran her hand over the wool. It was coarse, but it was strong. She took off the ripped, muddy cotton dress she had worn for she did not even know how long. She washed her face and hands in a horse trough, the cold water stinging her. She pulled the new dress over her head. It fell to her ankles, a little loose in the waist, but it was warm. It covered her. She pulled on the stockings, wincing as the wool touched the raw cuts on her feet, and then slid her feet into the boots. They were stiff, but they were solid. They had soles. She looked down at herself. She was no longer the half-naked creature who had fled into the storm. She looked like a person. But the feeling that rose in her was not gratitude. It was a suffocating, crushing wave of shame. He had paid for her. Just like Silas. He had bought her. He had traded valuable gear for her. And she had nothing. She had nothing to give in return. She was a debt, a burden. She walked out of the livery, her steps stiff in the new boots. Eli was waiting, the horses ready. He looked her over, a quick, assessing glance. "Better," he said, his voice neutral. He nodded. "We'll camp outside of town. This place is too loud." They rode a mile upstream and found a small clearing sheltered by cottonwoods. As Eli built a fire and began slicing bacon into a skillet, Clara stood by the creek, twisting her hands. The shame was a sickness in her belly. She knew what was expected. She knew how these transactions worked. I can't pay you for these," she said, her voice shaking. Eli did not look up from the fire. "Wasn't looking for payment." "But I have nothing," she insisted, her voice desperate. I can work. I can cook for you. I can mend your clothes. I can—" She stopped. The next word stuck in her throat. The unspoken offer of the only other thing she had. Eli stopped what he was doing. The hand holding the knife went still. He looked up at her, and his eyes were not quiet anymore. They were hard, like chips of dark ice. It was the same anger she had seen when she told him she was traded. "Clara," he said. He had asked her name on the trail yesterday, and it was the first time he had used it. It sounded strange. "You don't owe me," he said, his voice low and intense, each word sharp. "Not for the food, not for the clothes, not for thanks." He stood up, pointing the knife at the ground. not at her. "And you damn sure don't owe me your body. You understand?" She stared, bewildered. "I bought you clothes because you needed clothes. I'm feeding you because you're hungry. That's the end of it." He turned back to the skillet, and the sizzle of the bacon was the only sound. Clara stood frozen. His words hit her harder than a slap. She had understood cruelty. She had understood the cold calculation of her father and the brutal hunger of Silas Croft. She knew how to navigate a world where everything had a price, and she was the currency. This she did not understand. His restraint, his absolute refusal to take anything from her, was more confusing than any cruelty had ever been. It terrified her. It meant he saw her as something other than a debt to be paid or a body to be used. It meant she might actually be a person, and she had no idea how to be one. She backed away and sat on a log, her body trembling, more frightened of his kindness than she had ever been of another man's violence. They pushed south for 3 more days. The land turned hard and flat. A high, empty plain where the wind had nothing to stop it. The sky turned a sickly, yellowish gray. Eli kept looking to the west, his face grim. "Sandstorm," he said, his voice tight. "A bad one. We need cover. Now." He spurred his horse, pulling the Mustang's lead rope. "Hold on." Clara bent low, clutching the saddle horn as they raced across the plain. The wind was rising, a high, thin scream. She could see it coming, a rolling wall of brown dust that blotted out the sun. "There!" Eli shouted, pointing. On the flat, empty horizon, a dark shape shimmered, a derelict homestead. The house had long since collapsed into a pile of sod and broken timber, but a barn, leaning hard to the east, was still standing. They reached it just as the first wave of grit hit them. The wind struck the barn with the force of a physical blow. Eli fought the door open, a heavy slider, and shoved the spooked horses inside. He slammed it shut, dropping the bar just as the storm hit full force. The world outside vanished. The barn was plunged into a near-total darkness, the only light coming from the cracks between the boards, cracks that now streamed sand like water from a sieve. The sound was a deafening, continuous roar, as if the barn were at the bottom of the ocean. It was not just wind, it was the sound of 1,000 screaming voices, the sound of the world being scoured to the bone. They huddled in an empty stall, pulling their blankets over their heads. Sand was everywhere, in their eyes, their mouths, their hair. It was suffocating. They sat like that for hours. The storm did not lessen. It only grew louder, the barn groaning and shaking around them. The darkness, the confinement, the terrifying, inescapable sound. It broke the careful wall Clara had built around herself. She had been running. Now she was trapped. She began to cry. Not the quiet tears Eli had ignored by the fire. This was a raw, tearing sob that came from the deepest part of her. It was the sound of her own breaking. Eli sat still beside her, a dark shape in the howling gloom. My father," she gasped, the words ripped from her. "I begged him." She pulled her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth. The storm was too loud. She had to shout to be heard. "He was drinking. He said the horses were more important. He said I was just another mouth to feed. I held on to his legs. I begged him not to sell me." She was weeping openly now, the tears washing tracks through the grit on her face. "And that man, Silas, he looked at me like I was meat. He tied me up. He said he'd get his money's worth. He said I just needed breaking." She clawed at her own arms, at the clean wool of the dress Eli had bought her. "I'm afraid of my own body," she whispered, her voice raw. "I'm afraid of what it's for. I feel dirty. I feel ruined, like I'm not whole anymore. He ruined me." Eli did not move. She could just see his silhouette against the whistling cracks in the wall. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jump. His hands were fisted on his knees. The anger coming off him was a palpable thing, a heat in the cold stall, but it was held in an iron, terrifying control. He waited. He let her say it all. He let the words hang in the screaming, sand-filled air until her sobs quieted into exhausted, shuddering breaths. The wind was the only sound for a long time. Then he spoke. His voice was soft, but it cut through the roar of the storm. It was rough as gravel. "They broke the law of God and man," he said. "You didn't—" Clara stopped, her breath catching. She looked at him, a shadow in the darkness. "You ain't dirty," he said, his voice flat and certain. "You're hurt. That ain't the same thing." The storm blew itself out by dawn, leaving a world that was scoured and silent. They were both exhausted, their bodies covered in a fine layer of dust. They slept in shifts in the ruined barn, too tired to move on. Clara fell into a deep, heavy sleep, but it was not restful. She dreamed. She was back in the shack. Silas was there, his pale eyes laughing. The rope was on her wrists, but this time it was a snake, tightening, pulling her down. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was running, but her feet were stuck, sinking into a floor made of mud. He was reaching for her. "You're mine, paid for." "No!" she screamed, waking herself up. "Please!" She sat bolt upright, lashing out with her hands, her heart trying to hammer its way out of her chest. "Clara." Eli was there, kneeling beside her bedroll. The dim morning light from the broken door outlined him. "You're safe. You're in the barn. He ain't here." She was gasping, still lost in the terror, the dream more real than the man in front of her. She was trembling, unable to stop. He reached out, his hand open, palm up, an offering. She stared at it, uncomprehending. He moved slowly, gently. He took her hand. His grip was warm. It was solid. It was the first human touch she had felt since. It was not a claiming grip. It was not a bruising, holding grip. It was an anchor. It was just there. His thumb rubbed a slow circle on the back of her hand. A steady, calming pressure. "Just the wind," he murmured, his voice low. It was just the storm. "You're safe. Clara, I'm right here. You're safe." He did not let go. He just stayed there, kneeling on the barn's dirt floor, holding her hand, a solid, living presence in the cold morning. The warmth of his skin seeped into hers, a steady heat that pushed back the icy fear. The hammering in her chest slowed. The dream faded, replaced by the smell of hay and the quiet breathing of the horses. She was not alone. She fell back asleep, her hand still held firmly in his. The world was scrubbed clean. The sandstorm had passed, leaving the air crisp and the sky a brilliant, pale blue. They were both filthy, their skin caked with grit. They found a small, clear stream running through a shallow canyon, lined with cottonwoods just beginning to turn gold. "We should clean up," Eli said, his voice practical. He nodded downstream. "You take that side. I'll stay up here. Take your time." He gave her privacy. Clara went behind a thicket of willows, undressed, and waded into the icy water. It was a shock, so cold it stole her breath, but it felt good. She scrubbed her skin, her hair, washing away the dirt of the storm, the lingering filth of the shack. She washed the wool dress and laid it on a sun-warmed rock to dry, wrapping herself tightly in her blanket. When she finished, she walked back, her hair damp and clinging to her neck. Eli was upstream, as he had promised. His back was to her. He had stripped off his shirt and was washing himself from the waist up. Clara stopped. His back was a roadmap of violence. She had seen men beaten, but this was something else. Long, pale, puckered lines from a blade. 3 or 4 round, deep divots where bullets had gone in and stayed. And across his shoulders and back, the faint, crisscrossed lattice of old whip marks. She made a small, sharp sound, a gasp she could not hold back. He heard it. He went still for a second, then turned around. Clara flinched. It was instinctive. A bare-chested man, his muscles clear and defined, water dripping from his hair. Her mind screamed Silas. He saw her flinch, and he stopped, not moving toward her, but not rushing to cover himself either. He just stood there in the shallow water, letting her look. His chest was as scarred as his back. War? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Some, he said, his voice flat. He touched one of the round scars on his ribs. Gettysburg and the Wilderness. He turned slightly, showing the marks on his back. And some from Andersonville. They didn't care for scouts. He walked out of the water, picked up his shirt, but didn't put it on. He sat on a rock, wringing out his undershirt, his movements economical and precise. And some, he said, his voice dropping lower, ain't from the war. He looked out across the water, his gaze distant. He was not looking at her, but speaking to the empty air. Came home, was gone 4 years. Found the woman I was meant to marry. She'd taken up with a carpetbagger from Ohio, a man with clean hands and new money. He paused, a muscle tightening in his jaw. She said I was broken, too quiet. Said I had too many ghosts. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred. She wasn't wrong. The confession hung in the air between them, as clear and cold as the water. He was broken, too. He had been hurt. He had been abandoned, deemed unworthy. A fragile, aching empathy bloomed in her chest. He was not just a protector. He was a man who understood, in his own way, what it meant to be damaged. Clara took a step toward him. He watched her, his eyes wary. She moved slowly. Her hand was trembling, but she raised it. She stopped, her fingers hovering inches from his chest, where a long, thin scar ran parallel to his collarbone. She was not asking for anything. She was offering. She let her fingers, barely, so lightly, touch the raised, pale skin of the scar. "Does it still hurt?" she whispered. His breath hitched, a sharp, sudden intake of air. His entire body went rigid, as if she had touched him with a hot iron. His eyes, fixed on hers, blazed. The quiet sadness was gone, replaced by a fire, a deep, primal want that was so intense it was almost frightening. It was a starved, desperate longing that she felt like a wave of heat. The air crackled between them, thick and heavy. Then, as quickly as it came, he mastered it. He clenched his jaw, his eyes shutting for a brief second. He shook his head, a single, sharp motion. He stood up abruptly, stepping back, away from her touch. He grabbed his shirt and strode past her, back toward the horses, putting distance between them. He left her standing by the river, her hand still held in the air, the cold spot where he had been burning against her palm. That night, they were back in the abandoned barn. The air was cold, and a sliver of moon shed a weak light through the broken roof. They had not lit a fire. The tension from the river was still between them, a new, sharp awareness that had not been there before. They lay in their separate bedrolls, but closer this time, sharing a corner of the stall for warmth. Clara could not sleep. She was not afraid of him. Not anymore. She was alive. Her body, which she had learned to fear and hate, was thrumming. The touch by the river, his raw, unguarded reaction. It had made her feel something she had never felt, wanted, not as property, not as a thing to be used, but as a woman. She wanted, desperately, to feel something good. She wanted to feel human. She wanted to feel safe and wanted, all at the same time. She turned over on her side. Eli was lying on his back, staring up at the sliver of moon. Slowly, testing the air, she moved. She hitched her bedroll closer to his. She hesitated, then leaned against him, resting her head and shoulder against his arm and chest. He stiffened instantly, his body going as rigid as stone. She whispered into the fabric of his shirt, I want to feel something good." He did not move for a long, stretched-out minute. She could hear his heart, hammering against her ear, a fast, heavy beat. Then, slowly, the tension eased from his muscles. He did not wrap his arm around her. He did not pull her closer. He just let her be there. He accepted her presence. He turned his head. His breath stirred her damp hair. He leaned down, and she felt the light pressure of his lips against her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion. It was not the hungry claiming she had feared. It was a kiss of blessing, a promise. "Not yet," he murmured, his voice rough and thick. "Not like this. Not when you're cold and running and scared." He pulled back just enough to look at her in the dim, pearly light. His eyes were dark and serious. "When you ask," he said, his voice heavy with an emotion she could not name, "I want you to ask with your whole heart, not because you're scared, not because you think you owe me, but because you're whole. And you want me." Clara looked at him, her throat tight. He was giving her back something she thought was gone forever. He was giving her back her own body. He was telling her it was hers to give, not his to take. He was waiting. For her. She lay back down, still close enough to feel the warmth of him, but separate. She finally understood. Healing wasn't about forgetting what her father had done, or what Silas had tried to do. It wasn't about pretending she wasn't broken. It was about this, lying in the dark, next to a man with his own scars, and feeling safe enough to be touched, and, for the first time in her life, safe enough not to be. The high plains were a hard, dry world. They left the abandoned barn and rode south. But the land offered no comfort. This was not the high, rocky country of the storm, but a vast, empty tableland of cracked alkali flats and brittle, yellow grass. The sun was a hammer, and the wind was a constant, abrasive force that stole the moisture from their skin and the hope from their hearts. They traveled for more than a week, seeing no one. Eli was pushing toward a town called Three Forks, a small settlement on the Sweetwater River. "I got a friend there," he said, and that was all. He did not speak of what this friend did, or how he could help. Eli was not a man for sharing plans. He was a man for riding, and for watching. The journey pressed down on them. Their supplies from Bitter Creek ran low. Eli shot a scrawny jackrabbit, which they boiled with the last of their salt. It was stringy and thin, but it was meat. Clara learned to bake small, dense cakes of flour and water on a hot rock by the fire. They tasted like dust, but they filled the emptiness in her belly. Hunger was a constant, dull ache, a reminder of their fragility in this enormous, indifferent land. One afternoon, Clara, walking the Mustang to rest its back, nearly stepped on a rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a sagebrush. It buzzed, a dry, electric sound that froze her blood. She stumbled back, crying out, before she had even found her feet. Eli was off his horse. His movements were a blur. He did not draw his gun. He snatched the long bullwhip from his saddle, and with a single, explosive crack, the snake's head was gone, severed clean. Clara was shaking, leaning against the warm, solid flank of the Mustang. Eli recoiled the whip, his face grim. "Watch the shade," he said, his voice tight. "They're moving now. It's getting cold." He did not comfort her. He did not ask if she was all right. He had dealt with the threat. That was his comfort. Another day. 2 days later, he stopped, holding up his hand. Clara reined in. He pointed to the far horizon, to the west, a small plume of dust. "Riders," he said. "Who?" she whispered. "Don't matter." He turned his horse, nudging her Mustang, moving them off the faint trail and into a series of broken, rocky hills. They rode hard for 2 hours, taking a long, winding detour that cost them half a day. He was a scout. He knew how to move without being seen, and he was teaching her. They were not just traveling, they were hiding. They were both worn thin. Their silence, once a heavy thing, had changed. It was a shared silence now. They moved as one, a small, 2-person caravan. She would gather the brush for the fire. He would picket the horses. He would clean his rifle. She would mend the small tear in his shirt sleeve, using the kit she'd insisted on buying with the last of his credit. They were a team, bound not by words, but by the shared hardships of the trail. They finally reached the Sweetwater, a thin green ribbon in the dry landscape. They followed it toward Three Forks. On a Saturday evening, they camped a few miles outside the settlement, in a grove of tall cottonwoods that rustled in the breeze. They were exhausted, filthy, and bone-weary. The next morning, as Eli was checking the horses' hooves, a man approached their camp. He was tall, thin as a rail, and wore a dusty black coat. He carried a Bible in one hand and a walking stick in the other. He stopped a polite distance from their fire. "Good morning, my friends," the man said. His voice was warm and carried. "The Lord's peace be upon this camp." Eli stood, his hand not moving toward his gun, but near it. "Morning, preacher." "Brother Gideon, at your service." The preacher smiled, a kind, weary expression. "I saw your smoke. I'm holding a small gathering this morning, just down by the river, a little prayer, a little song, for those of us far from home. The Lord's table is open to all who hunger." Clara looked at her own hands, caked with the grime of the trail. She looked at her wool dress, now stained and dusty. "We ain't fit for it, preacher," Eli said, his voice flat. "Nonsense," Brother Gideon said, his eyes resting on Clara. "The Lord don't look at the dust on your clothes, child. He looks at the heart. We'd be honored to have you." He nodded, then turned and walked away. Clara watched him go. A church, a gathering, singing. It felt like something from another life, a life before her father's whiskey, before Silas Croft. She looked at Eli. "I want to go," she whispered. Eli looked at her, his expression unreadable. He was a man who seemed to have no use for preachers or towns, but he saw the look in her eyes. "Go wash your face in the river, then," he said. "I'll wait." She hurried to the water. She scrubbed her face and hands, pulled her hair back into a tight, severe braid. She shook the dust from the blue wool dress. It was the only thing she owned. Besides the blanket, it was her armor. She walked back to the fire, her stomach twisting. She felt ashamed. She was going to stand before good, decent people, families. She was a woman bought for horses, a woman who had run away, a woman traveling alone with a man who was not her husband. The dress felt like a lie, a costume. The old scars on her wrists, though faded, seemed to burn. Eli was waiting. He had not changed, but he had combed his hair back with water. They walked 100 yards downriver to where a small group of people had gathered, perhaps 20 in all, a few families with children, some trappers, a handful of ranchers and their wives. They sat on logs and blankets under the shade of a massive cottonwood. As Clara and Eli approached, the conversation stopped. Every eye turned to them. They stared. They saw a hard-looking man, scarred and armed, his eyes cold and watchful. And they saw a young woman, her face thin, her dress dusty, her eyes wide and haunted. The women, in their clean calico dresses and Sunday bonnets, looked at Clara. Their gaze was a physical weight. They assessed her, judged her. They whispered behind their hands. Clara stopped. The shame was a hot, burning fire under her skin. She wanted to run, to hide back in the wilderness where the snakes and the hunger were, at least honest dangers. She took a step back. She felt Eli move beside her. He had stopped, too. She thought he would turn, that he would agree, that this was a mistake. Instead, he looked at her. His dark eyes were steady. He saw her shame, her fear. He understood what their whispers meant. Deliberately, in the full view of every staring man and woman. He reached down and took her hand. His grip was not gentle. It was solid, warm, and absolute. It was not a lover's caress. It was a statement. It was a claim, a circle of protection. He laced his rough fingers through hers, holding her hand tightly. Clara looked up at him. Her breath caught in her throat. His face was set, his jaw hard. He was looking at the crowd now, daring them. He kept his voice low. For her alone. "Let them look." He tugged her hand, and they walked forward together. They sat on a log at the back of the gathering. He did not let go of her hand. He held it, firm and warm, through the entire service. Clara did not hear the hymns. She did not hear Brother Gideon's words. She only felt the solid, living pressure of Eli's hand, a shield against the world. He was not ashamed of her. He was not hiding her. He was holding her hand in the sunlight. That night, the tension between them was a new thing. The air was charged. His public defense of her, the simple, profound act of holding her hand, had changed the space between them. They made their camp. The fire crackled, a small island of light in the vast darkness. Eli sat on his saddle, cleaning his rifle, the motions practiced and sure. Clara sat on her bedroll, her knees drawn up, watching him. She thought of his hand. She thought of the feeling of his skin against hers, a public declaration. It was so different from the secret. Healing touch in the barn. This was more. Eli? He looked up, his hand stilling on the rifle's steel barrel. Today, she said, her voice small. When you held my hand, in front of those people? He nodded, waiting. I've never... She struggled, searching for the right words. She took a breath. I want to feel wanted. It was a confession. It was more than needing to feel good. It was wanting to be wanted. By him. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. The firelight caught the planes of his face, the scars on his cheek. He put the rifle down, carefully. He stood up and walked to her. He did not sit, he knelt in the dirt in front of her, so their eyes were level. He did not speak. He raised his hands, not to her face, but to her shoulders, his grip gentle but firm. He looked into her eyes, asking a silent question, making sure she was not afraid. She did not pull away. She leaned forward, just a fraction of an inch. He kissed her. It was not the chaste, blessing kiss he had given her in the barn. This was a true kiss. It was slow, and it was reverent. His lips were chapped and firm, and they were unbelievably gentle. He kissed her as if she were something precious, something he was learning. He tasted of coffee and the faint, smoky tang of the trail. Clara's eyes fluttered closed. A warmth bloomed deep in her belly, a feeling so sweet and sharp it almost hurt. This was not a transaction. This was not a prelude to violence. This was a gift. Her hands, which had been clenched in her lap, rose. She rested them on his shoulders, feeling the hard muscle beneath his shirt. The kiss deepened. His hand moved from her shoulder, up her neck, to cup her jaw. His calloused thumb stroked her cheek. It was a claim, a question, and an answer all in one. She felt a spark, a desperate, rising need to be closer, to erase the last bit of space between them. He felt it, too. His breathing grew rough. The gentle kiss became hungry. And then he stopped. He pulled back, just an inch. His breathing was heavy, his eyes dark and burning. He rested his forehead against hers. Soon, Clara, he whispered, his voice thick. But not here, not in the dirt, when we're running. He was still honoring his own words. He was still giving her control. He pulled back, gave her hand a final, firm squeeze, and stood up. He went back to his rifle, and the silence that fell between them was no longer empty, but filled with a promise that left her trembling. Eli rode into Three Forks alone the next morning, to find his friend. He told Clara to stay with the camp, to keep out of sight, to not light a fire. She watched him ride away, his back straight, and felt a lurch of panic at being left alone. She spent the day by the river. The loneliness was heavy. She was safe. She knew that. Eli had left her the pistol, but his absence was a new kind of ache. She went to the water's edge, to the same spot where they had washed after the storm. She knelt and looked down. Her reflection stared back. The face in the water was not the girl who had been traded. The bruises were gone. The terror had receded from her eyes. She was thin. Yes, she was weather-beaten. Her hair was lighter from the sun, but her eyes, they were clear. They were her own. She thought of Silas. She thought of his words. Dirty, ruined, property. She thought of Eli's kiss. She thought of his restraint. She thought of his hand holding hers in front of the whispering townsfolk. She had felt ruined. She had believed she was a bolt of cloth, stained and torn, tossed aside. But as she looked at her own face, a new thought, hard and clear as a piece of quartz, rose in her. You cannot ruin a person. You can hurt them. You can break them. You can steal from them. But you cannot ruin them. She was not ruined. She was wronged. The shame that had burned her skin at the preacher's gathering suddenly lifted. It was not her shame to carry. It was her father's. It was Silas Croft's. It was the shame of the men who stared and the women who whispered. It was not hers. She had survived. She splashed the cold water on her face, and when she looked up, she was smiling. It was a small, watery, unsteady smile, but it was hers. Eli returned at dusk. She knew from the way he rode, his shoulders set and his pace hard, that something was wrong. He dismounted, his face a grim, cold mask. "Pack your things," he said. His voice was flat. "We're leaving. Now." "What is it?" she asked, her newfound courage wavering. "Your friend." "My friend is a merchant," Eli said, kicking dirt over the cold ashes of their fire. "He travels. He hears things." He stalked to his saddlebags, checking his ammunition. "He was up near South Pass a few weeks ago. A man came into his store, a cattleman, Silas Croft." Clara froze. The name was a blow. "He's put the word out," Eli said, his voice a low, cold growl. "He's offering a bounty for stolen property." He slung his saddlebag onto his shoulder. "He's offering $50 for your return. No questions asked. $50. The price of a good horse." Eli grabbed her bedroll and shoved it into her arms. "We ride north, into the mountains. I know places he'll never find. We can lose them. But we have to go now, before word gets out that we're here." He was in a cold panic. He was a scout again, and they were being hunted. Clara stood still, the bedroll in her arms. She did not move. "Clara," he snarled. "Move!" "No." The word was quiet, but it stopped him cold. He turned, his face dark with disbelief. "What did you say?" "I said no." Her voice was shaking, but she held her ground. She thought of her reflection in the water. She was not property. "I'm tired of running," she said, her voice gaining a small measure of strength. "I ran from my father's house. I ran from that shack. I've been running with you ever since. Hiding." "This is different," he said, stepping toward her. "This is a bounty. These men won't just talk. They'll shoot." "It's not different," she said, standing up straighter. "It's the same. He's hunting me like I'm one of his cattle that got loose. If we run, he's right. If we hide, I'm still just property. I'm just something he lost." She looked him in the eye. "I don't want to be hidden anymore." "Clara," he said, his voice raw. "They will kill me to take you. You understand that?" "Then we'll fight," she said, her hands clenching the bedroll. "But I am not running." "Not this time." He stared at her. He saw the terror in her, but he also saw the iron. This was not the broken girl who had stumbled into his fire. This was the woman who had held his gaze by the river. This was the woman who had walked into that crowd. She was making a stand. Here, now. The air between them was electric. The danger, the refusal, the kiss, it all crested in this one terrible, defining moment. He did not argue. He just nodded. Once. He took the bedroll from her and, instead of packing it, he unrolled it, spreading it on the ground beside his own. He built the fire back up. Not a small, hidden fire, but a bright, defiant one. He was no longer a scout hiding. He was a man making a stand. They sat by the fire, side by side, sharing a blanket. The night was cold and sharp. The danger was out there, a living thing in the darkness. Clara was trembling. Her brave words echoed in the silence, and she was terrified. She looked at Eli. He was cleaning his pistol, his movements precise. "Eli, I'm here." "What he said about me," she whispered, her voice catching. "Property. What he tried to do." She looked down at her hands. Does it make me less? Does it make me dirty?" She finally turned to him, the tears she had refused to shed now blurring her vision. "Does it make you not want me?" Her voice broke. "Do you still want me, even after what they did?" Eli put the pistol down. He turned, his whole body, and took her face in both his hands. His palms were rough and warm, and his hold was infinitely tender. He made her look at him. "Clara," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Look at me." She met his gaze. "What they did, what he is, that was a sin. It was a crime. It has nothing to do with you. It did not change what you are." He thumbed a tear from her cheek. "It didn't make you less." His eyes burned into hers. "It didn't make you dirty." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "And it damn sure didn't make me not want you." He took a sharp breath. "I never wanted you more." He kissed her. It was not the reverent kiss of the night before. This was a kiss of truth, of hunger, of desperation and defiance. It was a kiss that sealed her brave words. It was deep and it was raw. And it was everything she had been starving for. He pulled back, just enough to speak against her lips. "I want you, Clara, all of you, the woman who ran barefoot through the storm, the woman who held my hand in front of those people, the woman who just told a bounty hunter, 'No, I want you.'" "Yes," she whispered, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. "Yes, Eli." This was her whole heart. This was her choice. He laid her back on the bedrolls. He undressed her slowly, his hands shaking, his reverence at war with his hunger. He unwrapped her as if she were a treasure. He kissed the faded, rope-burn scars on her wrists. He kissed the place on her cheek where the bruise had been. He murmured praises against her skin, his voice thick, beautiful, strong, mine. He was renaming her. He was reclaiming her. He was erasing the words property, traded, ruined. He was scarred, and she was scarred. He was broken, and she was broken. But as he covered her body with his, they were whole. He was slow. He was intense. He was teaching her what it meant to be touched by a man who was not taking, but giving. He was showing her what it meant to be cherished. And when he finally joined their bodies, she wept. He froze, his body tensing, his face filled with a sudden, terrible fear. "Clara, did I hurt you?" She shook her head, her hands clutching his back, his shoulders. She buried her face in his neck, her sobs shaking both of them. "No," she cried. "No, it's not." She was weeping not from pain, but from relief. It was a flood, a breaking of the final dam. All the fear, the shame, the worthlessness. It was all washing away in the tide of his tenderness. She was not property. She was his, and she was, finally, wondrously, her own. She was cherished. The bright, defiant fire they had built by the Sweetwater was an invitation. Eli knew it. He had spent his life reading signs, and their open camp was a clear signal. They were done running, but they were not fools. They could not stay. Word of a $50 bounty, a high price for a runaway girl, would travel fast. It was more money than most men in Three Forks would see in a season. It was enough to make a decent man turn greedy, and a greedy man turn violent. Eli's merchant friend had given them flour, beans, and a box of rifle cartridges. "Get north," he had advised, his eyes grim. "Get into the high passes. Lose them in the high lonesome. Winter's your only friend now." They rode out before dawn, pushing north toward the Wind River Range. The land changed fast, rising from rolling, dry plains into a hard, broken country of deep canyons and sheer granite walls. The air grew thin and bitingly cold. There was no trail here, only the high, faint paths of game. Eli was in his element, his body leaning forward in the saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges above them. He was a scout again, and they were in enemy territory. Clara rode beside him now, not behind. She had learned to read his movements. A slight tensing of his shoulders meant he saw something. A hand raised, palm flat, meant stop. She no longer felt like a burden. She felt like a partner. Her fear had not vanished. It had simply burned down into a hard, watchful coal. She had his pistol, the one he had bought in Bitter Creek, tucked into the waistband of her dress, the cold steel a constant, heavy reminder of her promise. For 3 days, they saw no one. They saw elk, high on the ridges, and the tracks of a mountain lion. But on the 4th day, Eli stopped them. He dismounted, knelt, and touched the ground. He pointed to a small, almost invisible sign, a horseshoe print, fresh, the edges still sharp, and another, 3 riders. "They're tracking us," he said, his voice flat. "They're good." How did they find us?" Clara whispered, her hand going to the pistol. "That merchant in Bitter Creek," Eli said, his jaw tightening. "Or someone in Three Forks. It doesn't matter. They're behind us, and they're closing." He looked up at the sky. A high, thin layer of gray cloud was moving in from the northwest. The wind had a new edge, a sharp, icy howl that promised snow. "We can't outrun them, not with the horses this tired. We have to find a place." He led them on, not faster, but with more urgency, his path weaving through a maze of house-sized boulders. The canyon narrowed. The bitter winter winds tore at them, funneling between the high walls. Clara pulled her blanket tighter, her hands numb on the reins. They rounded a sharp bend, and Eli pulled his horse to a sudden halt. There! It was a cabin, or the ghost of one. It was built into the granite side of the mountain, half rock, half timber, with a low sod roof that was overgrown with winter-killed grass. It was an old trapper's cabin, long abandoned, but the walls looked solid. A small, leaning shed stood nearby, just big enough inside to shelter the horses. "Get inside," Eli commanded. "Get the horses into the shed. Don't unsaddle them," while Clara fumbled with the stiff, frozen ropes. Eli climbed the rocks above the cabin. He lay flat, his rifle resting on the stone, watching their back trail. She led the horses into the dark, cold shed. It was a relief to be out of the wind. She ran to the cabin, pushing open the heavy, rough plank door. It was dark and smelled of cold ashes, dust, and old animals. But it was solid. A small stone fireplace was built into the mountain wall. A crude 3-legged stool and a broken cot were the only furniture. It was a fortress. She ran back out. "Eli!" "I see them," he called down. His voice was calm, but it carried a deadly edge. "They're a mile back, taking their time." He slid down the rocks, landing lightly on the packed earth. He grabbed his saddlebags. "They know we're in this canyon. They know we're trapped. They think they have us." He pushed Clara toward the cabin. "Stay here. Stay away from the door. Away from the one window. Don't make a sound." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her heart hammering. "Remind them that $50 is a poor price for a funeral," he said. He grabbed his rifle and vanished back into the rocks. Clara retreated into the dark cabin. She crouched by the cold fireplace, her hands clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. She waited. The wind howled, a lonely, screaming sound. It was the only sound for a long, terrible hour. Then she heard it, a single rifle shot. It was sharp, loud, cracking through the wind. It echoed off the canyon walls, 12 times, making it impossible to tell where it came from. Silence. She waited. Another 10 minutes, another shot, from a different place. The trap was sprung. Another hour passed. The gray light in the cabin was beginning to fade. She was starting to panic, a cold dread creeping into her veins. When the door opened, Eli slipped inside. He was not hurt. His face was grim, but calm. "They're gone," he said. Did you? "No," he said, leaning his rifle by the door. "I just made it uncomfortable. Fired from 3 different places. They think I'm not alone. They're bounty men. Clara, they're not soldiers. They're in it for easy money, not a pitched battle in a blizzard." He looked out the small, dirty window. "They'll be back, but not today. They'll wait for the weather to break, or for us to starve." He turned and gave her a small, tight smile. "Let's see about not starving." That night, the storm hit. The wind was a solid, screaming force, and the snow began. A thick, horizontal blast that erased the world. They were safe. The bounty men could not move in this, and neither could they. They were snowed in. Eli had been right about the cabin. It was sturdy. He chinked the worst of the cracks with mud and straw he found in the shed. Clara swept the floor with a branch of pine. They brought the saddles inside, both for their protection and to use as seats. They lit a fire. For the first time since she had stumbled into his camp, Clara felt something like a flicker of home. For 2 days, the blizzard raged. On the third morning, the wind died, and the world was silent, white, and dazzlingly bright. They were sealed in. The snow was drifted 5 feet high against the door. "We need food," Eli said. "The deer will be moving, looking for browse." He took his rifle and his rope, and spent an hour digging his way out of the cabin. He was gone for most of the day. Clara waited, feeding the fire, melting snow for water, her fear a constant companion. He returned just before dusk, a dark shape against the blue-white snow. He was dragging a young buck. He was exhausted, but he was successful. "We eat," he said. They butchered the deer together on the floor of the shed. Eli showed her how to skin it, how to make the cuts. Clara's hands were covered in blood. The girl who had flinched at a harsh word was now elbow-deep in the raw, steaming work of survival. She did not gag. She did not cry. She learned. That night, they roasted venison over the fire. It was the best meal she had ever eaten. "You need to learn," he said the next day. The sun was bright, the air still and freezing. "Learn what?" "To shoot." He handed her the pistol. It was heavy in her hand. "I can't," she said, looking at the weapon. It was a thing of violence. "You can," he said, his voice hard. "You think those men are gone for good? They're just waiting. They want you. They'll kill me to get to you. And when I'm dead, what will you do?" His words were brutal, but they were true. She thought of Silas. She thought of her father. She would not be property again. "Show me," she said. He took her outside. He set a pine cone on a rock, 20 paces away. He stood behind her. "It's not like the rifle," he said. "It's for close work, but the rules are the same." He put his hand over hers, holding the pistol. His body was warm against her back. "You don't pull the trigger. You squeeze it, slow. Let the gun surprise you." She flinched when the gun went off. The sound a sharp, flat crack in the silent, snowy world. The pine cone was untouched. Again. She fired again, and again. She was wasting bullets, but he didn't stop her. She was learning the feel of it, the kick, the weight. She was learning the power. "I can't hit it." "You're afraid of it," he said. "Don't be afraid of it. Respect it. It's a tool. Just like the knife you cut the deer with. It's just a tool." He stepped back. "Your turn." She raised the pistol. She sighted down the barrel. She thought of Silas Croft's pale, hungry eyes. She squeezed. The shot rang out. The pine cone vanished in a small puff of snow and bark. A slow, cold satisfaction filled her. She turned to Eli. He was not smiling. He just nodded. "Once." "Good," he said. "Now, again." She was reclaiming her body, her agency. It was not just a thing to be sold, or hurt, or used for love. It was a tool. It was a weapon. It was hers. They were trapped in the cabin for another week. The snow was deep, the world silent. The bounty hunters were a distant threat, held at bay by the weather. In the small, firelit space, they learned to live together. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. They talked. They sat by the fire, mending gear, sharpening knives. Clara found herself speaking of things she had never told another soul. "My mother," she said one night, her voice quiet. "She died when I was 12. She just faded. My father, he was always hard, but he was worse after she was gone. He said she was weak." She looked into the flames. "She wasn't weak. She was just tired. Tired of him. Tired of having nothing. I think she just let go." She took a shaky breath. "When he traded me to Silas, I was so angry, but I was also afraid. I was afraid I was like her. Afraid I would just let go." "You're not like her," Eli said, his voice rough. "You ran. You fought. I ran into you. You ran first," he said, his voice fierce. "You got out. You're a survivor. Clara, not a victim." She told him about Silas, not the attack she had fled, but the daily cruelties. He would talk. He said I was simple, that I was barely more than an animal he'd bought. He said he would break me, like a horse. He said it would be good for me, to learn my place. Eli's hand clenched on the knife he was sharpening. The sound of the whetstone was a low, angry hiss. She put her hand on his, stopping him. He was wrong. Eli looked at her, his eyes dark. He put the knife down. He looked into the fire. I told you about Mary and the war. He paused. I didn't tell you all of it. Clara waited. The man she left me for, the carpetbagger, he was rich and he was arrogant. He knew I'd been a scout. He thought I was just white trash, a hired killer. He taunted me in the street. He said Mary told him I was damaged, that the war had burned the man out of me. Eli's voice was a low, dangerous monotone. I was leaving town. I was on my horse. He rode up. He was drunk. He said he'd run me out. He pulled a pistol. He was on the ground. Eli whispered. He was begging, and I shot him again, right in the chest. I wanted him to be quiet. He looked at his own hands. That wasn't war. Clara, that wasn't a fight. That was cold. I killed him in cold blood. Clara looked at the man beside her, the man who had given her his blanket, the man who had kissed her forehead and told her to wait, the man who had held her hand in front of a mocking crowd. He was a good man, but he was also this. He was a man who had been pushed too far. She understood. She understood the rage. She understood the breaking point. She moved closer, took his hand. It was rigid. He was trying to kill you, she whispered. He was beaten, Eli said. He was a monster, Clara said, her voice fierce. Just like Silas. The world is better off without men like that. You did what you had to do. He looked at her, surprised. He had expected her to be horrified, to see the animal in him that Mary had seen. But she was not. She saw him. The confession, the acceptance. It broke the final boundary. He looked at her, at this woman who had survived, who had learned to shoot, who could look at the darkness in him and not flinch. He pulled her to him, his kiss rough, desperate. It was not the reverent, healing kiss of before. This was wild. This was a claiming. They were two equals, two survivors, two broken people who were whole together. Their passion deepened, shut in by the snow, fueled by their shared confessions. They were tender, and they were wild. He kissed the faded rope burns on her wrists, his lips tracing the old scars. This is how I knew you, he murmured. This is the mark of your strength. She was no longer ashamed of them. She traced the long, puckered scars on his back, the bullet holes, the faint lattice of the whip. And this is how I know you, she whispered. You survived. You came back. They were alive, and they were in love, and they were, for this one brief, stolen time, happy. They talked of the future. Montana, he said, his arm around her as they lay by the fire. I know a place, near Flathead Lake. It's green, good water, tall trees. We could build a cabin, a real one. A home, she whispered, the word tasting strange and wonderful. With no one to look at us. No one, he said. No one knows our names there. We can just be. The dream held them, a warm fire against the cold. Their happiness lasted until the thaw. The snow began to melt. The world outside dripped, and the bounty hunters returned. It was a sharp crack of a rifle that woke them. It was not a warning. It was a bullet, ripping through the wooden door, burying itself in the stone wall above their heads. Eli was moving before he was awake. He shoved Clara off the cot, onto the floor. Stay down. Eli! Another shot, this one shattering the small, glassless window. We know you're in there. Scout! A voice bellowed. It's 3 of us. Just send the girl out. We'll let you live. They're lying, Eli whispered. He crawled to his rifle. He was calm. He was a soldier. They're on the ridge, the 2 I saw before. And a new one. He peeked through a crack in the logs. "They're trying to flank. Clara, the pistol. Watch that door. Don't shoot unless it opens." He raised his rifle, aimed through the window. He waited. A man, bundled in furs, moved between two rocks. Eli fired. A sharp, high scream. "He got me! Jed's hit! Damn you, Scout!" The answering fire was a volley. Bullets tore through the small cabin. Wood splintered. Clara pressed herself into the dirt, her eyes shut tight. Eli moved to the other side of the cabin, trying to get an angle. "They're coming down," he said. "They're going to rush us." He fired again. The man on the ridge fired back. Eli grunted. It was a small sound, a sharp exhale of breath. He slumped against the wall. "Eli?" He didn't answer. He slid down, his rifle clattering to the floor. "Eli!" Clara scrambled to him. There was a dark, wet stain spreading high on his chest, near his shoulder. Blood. So much blood. "Clara!" he breathed, his face pale, his teeth gritted in pain. The rifle. She saw the blood. She saw him try to raise his hand and fail. The bounty hunters were shouting outside. They were coming. Rage, cold and pure, washed away her fear. She grabbed the heavy rifle. She crawled to the window. She saw a man, running low, dodging from the horse's shed toward the cabin. She rested the rifle on the sill. "Squeeze, don't pull." She thought of the pine cone. She thought of Silas. She thought of Eli, bleeding on her floor. She fired. The man spun, clutching his leg, and fell, cursing. "She's armed!" the third man shouted. "She shot Ben!" "It ain't worth $50. Grab Jed. Let's get out of here." Clara watched, the rifle stock pressed hard against her cheek. She saw two men dragging a third, limp body, running for their horses. The man she had shot was crawling. They left him. "Wait! Wait for me!" he screamed. They didn't. They mounted and rode, vanishing over the ridge. The man she had shot dragged himself behind a rock. Silence. She waited. She counted to 100. The man behind the rock was groaning. Then, he too was silent. She turned back to Eli. He was unconscious. She grabbed his legs. He was a heavy man, all muscle and bone. She dragged him, an inch at a time, away from the door, to the cot. She ripped open his shirt. The bullet had gone in high, in his side, just below the armpit. It was bleeding, a dark, pulsing flow. She ripped strips from the blue wool dress, the one he had bought her. She packed the wound, pressed down with all her strength. She bound his chest, tight, the wool turning dark. She melted snow. She washed the blood from his skin. She sat, holding his hand, as the cabin grew dark. He had a fever. It came on fast. He was burning, his skin dry. He was delirious. He was back in Andersonville, begging for water. He was fighting, calling out names she didn't know. He was arguing with Mary. I'm not broken." Clara bathed his face. "I'm here, Eli," she whispered. "I'm here." On the third night, his fever was high. She thought she was losing him. He thrashed, his eyes open but unseeing. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He was looking at her, really looking, but he wasn't seeing her. "Angel," he breathed. You came." "I'm here," she wept, holding his hand to her face. "Don't," he whispered, his voice desperate, broken. "Don't leave me. I won't leave." "She left," he murmured, his eyes full of a pain that had nothing to do with the bullet. "She said I was not good enough, broken. You'll see. I'm not good enough. Please, don't leave." His confession, so raw, so terrified, broke her heart. This man, her savior, her protector. He was afraid she would leave him. He, who had walked through fire, was afraid he was not good enough for her. She laid her head on his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. "I'm not leaving," she promised, her voice thick. "I'm never leaving. You gave me more than they ever thought I was worth," she sobbed, clutching him. "You gave me back to me. I'm staying." His hand, which had been clutching her, relaxed. He fell into a deep, true sleep. The fever broke the next morning. When he woke, his eyes were clear. He was weak, but he was alive. He saw her, asleep, her head resting on the edge of the cot, her hand still holding his. He slowly, weakly, raised his other hand and touched her hair. He healed slowly. She was the hunter now. She took the pistol, and she was not afraid of it. She shot rabbits, close, and she cooked them. She nursed him, changing his bandages, forcing broth down his throat. He was weak, and she was strong. She had saved him. He was finally sitting up, his back against the cabin wall, carving a piece of pine. Clara was cleaning, sweeping the dirt floor, setting their small world back to rights. In the corner, under the broken cot, she saw it, a bundle of dirty, tattered cloth. It was her shawl, the ripped, muddy shawl she had been wearing the night she fled Silas. She had kept it, a small, hidden reminder of who she was. She pulled it out. The fabric was stiff with old mud and fear. Eli was watching her. He didn't speak. He just watched. She looked at the shawl. She looked at the man she had just pulled back from death. She looked at her own hands, hands that were now strong, calloused, and capable. She walked to the fireplace. She held the tattered shawl over the small, steady flame. It was the last piece of that life. It was the last piece of the victim. She let it go. The wool smoked, then caught, flaring up in a bright, orange light. She watched it burn, the fabric curling, turning to black, brittle ash. It was final. She was not that person anymore. The past was gone. She turned back to Eli. He was smiling, a real, faint smile. "Cold?" he whispered, his voice still rough. She smiled back. "No. Come here," he said. She went to him and sat, and he put his good arm around her. They waited 2 weeks in the high, cold cabin. They waited for the snow to melt from the high pass, and for Eli's wound to heal. It was no longer a raw, open tear, but a deep, puckered scar, an angry red mark on his side. He was weak, and he moved stiffly, but the fever was long gone. Clara had nursed him, her strength growing as his returned. She had taken his pistol and hunted. She had brought back 2 more rabbits, and had learned to set snares. She was no longer a guest in his world. She was a partner in it. When he was finally strong enough to sit a horse, he stood by the cabin door, looking out at the thawing pass. "It's time," he said. "Where?" she asked. "Lander. It's the nearest town with a real lawman, a U.S. Marshal, or at least a county sheriff." "What? What for?" Eli turned to her. His face was leaner than she had ever seen it, his scars standing out, but his eyes were like iron. "For him? For Croft. I'm done hiding you. Clara, I'm done letting him hunt you. We're going to hunt him." She helped him mount, his hand gripping her shoulder as he swung his leg over, a pained grunt escaping his lips. She mounted the Mustang, the pistol tucked securely in her belt. They rode out of the canyon, leaving the small, safe cabin behind. They did not look back. They rode down from the high country, following a creek that widened into a river. The air grew warmer. They found the bounty hunter Clara had shot. He was dead, slumped behind the rock where he had crawled, his pistol still in his hand. Eli did not hesitate. He dismounted, took the man's rifle, his ammunition, and his horse, a sturdy-looking roan. He did the same for the man he had shot on the ridge, the one the others had abandoned. They now had 4 horses, 3 rifles, and a saddlebag full of ammunition. "He paid them to hunt us," Eli said, his voice cold as he coiled the roan's lead rope. "Now they'll pay to hunt him." They rode into Lander 2 days later. It was a proper town, not a mining camp or a dusty outpost. It had brick buildings, a bank, and a 2-story hotel, and it had a sheriff's office, with a painted tin star nailed to the door. Eli left her with the horses. "Wait here." He walked inside. Clara stood on the boardwalk, her heart a cold, heavy knot in her chest. This was it. This was the world she had run from. But she was not running anymore. She stood straight, her hand resting near the butt of her pistol. Through the window, she could see Eli talking to a man. A big man, with a graying mustache and a weary expression, a badge pinned to his vest. The man was shaking his head. Eli came out. His face was a mask of cold fury. "What?" she asked. "Sheriff Brody," Eli said, his voice tight. He says it's a civil matter." "What does that mean?" "It means he's not a lawman. He's a bookkeeper. He said a deal is a deal. He said what happens between a father and a buyer is a private transaction. He said unless I can prove Croft broke a territorial law." "He tried to kill us," Clara said, her voice rising. "He hired bounty men," Eli corrected, his voice dangerously low. "And the sheriff says that's just him trying to reclaim his property. He says we shot them. He says we're the ones who broke the law." Clara felt the ground drop out from under her. The law, the very thing they had come for. It was just another man, like her father, like Silas. It was a world that did not see her. "No," she said. Eli looked at her. "Clara." "No." He saw the iron in her. The girl he had saved was gone. This was the woman who had burned her shawl. A cold, hard light came into Eli's eyes. "You're right," he said. "To hell with him." He turned on his heel, not toward the trail out of town, but toward the livery. "Eli, what are you doing?" "He wants a civil matter," Eli snarled. "He wants a transaction? I'll give him one." He marched into the livery stable, dragging the 2 horses they had taken from the bounty hunters. He found the owner. "I'm selling 2 horses, 2 rifles, and 2 saddles." The liveryman, seeing the look in Eli's eyes, did not argue. He offered a low price. Eli took it. He walked out with a heavy canvas bag of coin. He strode back to the sheriff's office. He kicked the door open. "Brody!" The sheriff looked up, his hand moving to his own gun. "Get out of my office, son. I told you." Eli dumped the bag of coin on the desk. It split, and silver dollars spilled across the scattered papers. "What is this?" the sheriff asked. "That's $200, Eli said, his voice a low growl. "That's what those horses and gear were worth. Now, you said this was a transaction." He walked back out. He grabbed the lead ropes for his own bay and Clara's Mustang. He hauled them, their hooves clattering on the boardwalk, right into the sheriff's office. The horses shied, their eyes wide. "Eli!" Clara cried. "2 horses!" Eli shouted, slamming his hand on the desk, the coins rattling. "And $200 in silver. That's more than Croft paid. That's more than his bounty. That's interest." The sheriff was on his feet, his face purple. "You're insane. Get these animals out of here." "I'm buying her back," Eli roared, his face inches from the sheriff's. "You tell Croft that. You tell him she's my property now. You tell him I paid with interest. And you tell him if he, or any man he hires, ever comes within 100 miles of her again, I won't come to you. I will put him in the ground. You understand me? That's my transaction." The sheriff was speechless. He stared at the horses, at the silver, at the pure, cold, killing rage in Eli's eyes. He had seen men like this before. This was not a drifter. This was a soldier. This was a man who kept his promises. "Now, you can't just—" Brody stammered. "He's right," a new voice said. Clara stepped into the office, pushing past the nervous horses. Her voice was shaking, but it was clear, and it cut through the smell of fear and manure. "He's right. Sheriff," she said, her eyes locked on Brody's. "You can't buy me." She looked at Eli, her expression not angry, but pained. "Not you, not him, not anyone." Eli's rage faltered. He looked at her, confused. Clara turned back to the sheriff. The doorway behind her was filling up. Men from the street, merchants, teamsters, drawn by the shouting and the horses. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice growing stronger, projecting to the crowd in the street. "My father is Jedediah. He traded me to a man named Silas Croft. He traded me for 4 horses." A murmur went through the crowd. Women, wives from the mercantile, the hotel. They were stopping. They were listening. "I'm not property. Sheriff Brody," Clara said, her voice ringing in the small, crowded room. "I'm a person. And Silas Croft did not treat me like a person. He treated me like an animal. He tied me up." She held out her wrists. The scars were pale, almost invisible, but she held them up as if they were brands. "He left these marks, and when I would not submit, I ran for my life." The crowd was silent. The women were watching her, their faces hard, their eyes fixed. "And he hunted me," Clara continued, her voice breaking, "but strong. He put a bounty on my head. $50. Like a stolen horse. He sent 3 men. They found us in the mountains. They shot Eli." She pointed to Eli's bandaged side, the blood stain still visible on his shirt. "They tried to kill him. They tried to drag me back. I shot one. Eli shot one. The third ran." She stepped closer to the sheriff's desk, pushing aside the silver dollars. "Is that a civil matter, Sheriff? Is that a deal between men? Or is that kidnapping? Is that attempted murder? You tell me. What's the law? Here in Lander." The sheriff looked at her. He looked at the hard, angry faces of the men in the crowd. He looked at the women, who were watching him with a cold, assessing fury. This was no longer a simple problem. This was a powder keg. A woman in a gray bonnet, the banker's wife, stepped forward. "Sheriff," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "Is what the girl says true? You're going to let a man buy and sell women, here, and send killers after them?" Another woman, a young mother holding a child, caught Clara's eye. She did not speak. She just nodded once, and then she looked at her husband. A silent, clear demand. The sheriff paled. He saw his town, his authority, his very job, dissolving. "No, Mrs. Averill," he said, holding up his hands. "Of course not. It's not complicated," Clara said. "He is a criminal. Arrest him." The moment hung, thick and heavy. Eli stood by the horses, his hand still on his gun, watching Clara. He was no longer a protector. He was a witness. He was watching her save herself. That afternoon, they took a room at the hotel, a real room, with a bed, a pitcher, and a basin. Eli was silent. He was watching Clara as she stood by the window, looking down at the street. He had seen her as a victim, as a survivor, as a partner, as a lover. But today, he had seen her as a force. She had faced down a town, and she had won. He was in awe of her. There was a soft knock on the door. Clara opened it. A young girl, no more than 16, stood there. She was thin, pale, and twisting a piece of her apron in her hands. "Miss," the girl whispered. "Miss Clara?" "Yes." I heard you in the street. I was there." The girl looked terrified, her eyes darting back to the hallway. Can I ask you?" "Come in," Clara said. She shut the door. Eli stayed by the far wall, cleaning his rifle, silent but listening. "My name is Sarah," the girl whispered. My pa, he's going to marry me off to Mr. Abernathy from the feed store. He's old. He's 40, and his first 2 wives, they died. My pa says it's a good match. He says he's giving me to him next Sunday. He says I have to." Clara looked at the girl. She saw herself. The girl who had begged her father. The girl who had not known she had a choice. "He's not giving you, Sarah," Clara said, her voice soft but hard as steel. "You're not a sack of flour. He doesn't own you." "But he's my pa," Sarah cried, her eyes filling with tears. "The preacher says I have to obey." Clara grabbed the girl's arms. She held her firmly. "The preacher is a man. Your pa is a man. And Mr. Abernathy is a man. And they are all wrong." She looked into the girl's terrified eyes. "You have a choice. You just have to be strong enough to make it." What can I do?" "You run," Clara said, her voice low and fierce. "You hear me? You pack what you can, and you get on the first eastbound stage, or you steal a horse, or you just walk. You run until you are free, and you do not look back." "But I'm scared." "I know," Clara said. "I was scared, too. She thought of the pistol. "And if you can't run, then you fight." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "If he comes to your room on that Sunday, if he tries to take you, you fight. You find a pair of scissors. You find a piece of glass from a broken bottle. You find a rock. You scream. And you fight. And you show him that you are not his property. You are a person. You make him see it." Sarah was shaking, but she was also not. Her eyes were wide, but a small, hard spark had been lit. She was seeing a path, a terrible, dangerous path, but it was a path. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah whispered. She nodded. "Yes, I will." She turned and fled the room. Clara shut the door. She was trembling. She had just armed another girl for war. She turned. Eli was just watching her, his rifle still, his eyes full of an emotion she could not name. That night, the room was quiet. The town was quiet. The sheriff had sent a rider out to Croft's ranch with a warrant. Clara felt raw, exposed. She had won, but the battle had taken everything. Eli came to her. He did not kiss her. He just touched her hair. You were... I've never seen anything like it." "Clara, I was so angry," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice thick. He led her to the bed. He began to undress her, his hands gentle, almost hesitant. He was treating her like glass again, like she was precious, breakable. She stopped his hands. "No," she whispered. He looked at her, confused. Don't be afraid of me. Eli, don't treat me like I'll break." She took his hand and pressed it to her heart. "I'm not that girl, not anymore. I'm strong." She looked him in the eye. "I'm your equal." He searched her face, and he saw it was true. The last of the victim was gone. "I need," she said, her voice shaking, but for a different reason. "I need you to see me. The woman who stood in that street, the woman who shot that man, I need you to want her." A slow, hot fire lit in his eyes. He understood. Clara looked around the room. She saw a small silk scarf on the dresser, one she had bought with a few of the coins from the merchant. A small, blue thing, a piece of civilization. She picked it up. Her hands were trembling. "He used rope," she whispered, her voice so low Eli had to lean in to hear. "It was hard, and it was to break me." She held the soft blue silk out to him. I want to reclaim it. I want to trust you with all of me." Her voice broke. "I want you to take me, Eli, not like I'm breakable, like I'm yours, like I'm your equal." Eli's breath hitched. He looked at the scarf, then at her face. He saw the trust. He saw the strength. He saw the raw, desperate, healing need. His hands were shaking as he took the silk from her. "Clara, are you sure?" She nodded. She held out her hands, slowly. His eyes locked on hers. He wrapped the silk around her wrists. It was not tight. It was a gentle, loose, symbolic binding, a bond of trust, not captivity. He raised her hands to his lips. He kissed the silk, his breath warm on her skin. He kissed the old, pale scars beneath. "You are," he murmured, his voice thick with a passion that was almost holy, "the strongest person I have ever known." He laid her back on the bed, and this time, it was not just healing. It was not just tender. It was a fire. It was a deep, raw, consuming passion. He was not just making love to her. He was worshiping her. He worshipped her strength. He worships the body that had survived. He praised her, his words a thick murmur against her skin, claiming every part of her, not as property, but as his chosen, equal partner. It was wild, and it was sacred. And for Clara, it was the final, absolute act of liberation. The next morning, the sheriff was waiting for them. "He's here," Brody said. He looked exhausted. "Croft, he's in the lockup. He's raising hell." He led them to the small, barred cell at the back of his office. Silas Croft was there. He was standing, gripping the bars, his face a mask of purple rage. His fine clothes were rumpled. He saw them. He saw Clara. His eyes narrowed. "You!" he spat. You whore! You're mine! I paid for you! I paid 4 good horses!" Clara looked at him. She saw the man who had terrified her, the man who had haunted her nightmares, the man who had called her property. And she felt nothing. No fear, no anger, not even hatred. He was just a pathetic, loud, caged animal. He was small. He was still screaming, spittle flying from his lips. "When I get out of here, I'll hunt you down. I'll... Clara walked forward. She stood just out of his reach. Eli was right behind her, his hand on his gun, but she held up her own hand, stopping him. She looked Silas Croft dead in the eye. The silence stretched. His yelling faltered. She did not say a word. She just held his gaze. And then she spit on the ground, right at his feet, a single, sharp, final act of pure, unadulterated contempt. He roared, lunging, his hands reaching through the bars. But she was already turning away. He was not worth her words. He was not worth her fear. He was nothing. "Come on, Eli," she said. "Let's go." They walked out into the sunlight. "So," she said, taking a deep, clean breath of the free air. "Where to now?" Eli took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He looked up, to the north, toward the high, blue mountains just visible on the horizon. "Montana," he said. "I told you, I know a place by a lake. A quiet place. A place where no one knows our names," she finished, a small smile touching her lips. "That's the one," he said. They packed their horses. They rode out of Lander, side by side, and they did not look back. The ride north from Lander was a silent one for the first 10 miles. They left the dust and the judgment and the law behind them, and pointed their horses toward the high, unknown country. The world opened up. The land was vast. The sky a clean, sharp blue. They were 4 horses, 2 people, and a future that was, for the first time, truly their own. They crossed the high, cold desert of Wyoming, moving with the steady, unhurried pace of people who are no longer pursued. The tension that had lived in Eli's shoulders for months, the constant, watchful tightness, began to ease. He no longer scanned the back trail. He looked ahead. Clara, too, felt the change. The world was no longer a thing to be feared, a gauntlet to be run. It was just the world. She began to notice things she'd been blind to before. The way the wind made the prairie grass move in long, slow waves, like a green ocean. The precise, delicate flight of a kestrel hunting. The sharp, clean scent of sagebrush crushed under her horse's hooves. Their journey was long. Weeks turned into a month. They moved north, following the spine of the mountains, keeping to the high passes where travelers were few. The air grew colder. The first hard frosts of autumn turned the aspens to brilliant, shimmering gold. At night, a thin sheet of ice would form on the water bucket. Their new life took shape on the trail. It was a life of quiet partnership. In the evenings, Eli would sit by the fire. He had a new knife, and he took to carving. He was not a delicate artist. His movements were sure, economical, the way he did everything. He would take a piece of pine or cottonwood, and, in the space of an hour, a shape would emerge. A small, sturdy bird. A horse, head bowed against the wind. He would hand them to Clara without a word, and she would tuck them into her saddlebag. Clara, in turn, began to gather. She had learned from her mother, in those long-ago years before she faded, about the plants of the wild. She found yarrow for wounds, wild thyme and onion for their stews. She gathered pine nuts, roasting them in the fire. She was no longer just surviving the land. She was living with it. They spoke of the cabin. It was their evening ritual. "It should face the east," she would say, her hands busy mending a seam in his shirt. "I want to see the sun come up. It needs a deep fireplace," he would answer, his knife moving steadily. "Stone, not mud and stick, one that holds the heat, and a solid roof, pitched steep, so the snow slides. A window, she would add, her voice soft. A real one. With glass, so I can see the snow, but not feel the wind. We'll have it, he'd promise. We'll build it strong. They crossed into the Montana territory. The land was different, grand, green, and wild. The mountains were sharper, the forests thick with pine and fir. They found the lake Eli had spoken of. It was vast, a sheet of brilliant, impossible blue. Cradled by mountains that were already white with the first snow, it was here, in a small meadow protected by a high granite ridge, a few miles from the lake's shore. That, she realized. It had been weeks. She had been tired, but she blamed the altitude, the long days in the saddle. She had been tender, but she thought it was just the cold. But one evening, as she watched the moon, a sliver of ice in the dark sky, she counted the days, and a cold, sharp dread, heavier than any she had felt in Lander, settled in her stomach. She was late. Her monthly bleed had not come. She said nothing. For 2 days, she lived with a secret, a growing seed of panic. This was not possible. This was not part of the plan. The cabin, the quiet, the freedom. This was a chain. She thought of her mother. She saw her, clear as day, standing by a cold stove, her hands raw, her eyes empty. She saw a body, worn out, used up, and discarded. A body trapped, first by marriage, then by children, then by her husband's cruelty. A body that had, in the end, simply given up. Clara was terrified. She was afraid of this new, biological trap. She was afraid of becoming her mother. On the third night, she could not hold it in. The silence was too heavy. Eli was carving, the firelight catching the planes of his face, the pale lines of his scars. "Eli," she whispered. Her voice was so small, he barely heard it. He looked up. "What is it?" She could not look at him. She stared into the fire. I think I'm with child." The knife in his hand stilled. The forest was absolutely silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the distant, lonely call of an owl. He said nothing. He just sat, unmoving. I'm afraid," she whispered, the tears finally coming, hot and fast. "Eli, I'm so afraid. I don't want to be trapped." He put the knife down. He moved from his saddle to sit beside her on her bedroll. He did not touch her. Not yet. "Afraid of what? Clara? Of being like her, my mother. She was so tired. She had nothing. It took her, the life. It bled her dry." She buried her face in her hands. I just found me. I don't want to be trapped." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he gently pulled her hands away from her face. He made her look at him. His eyes were not angry. They were not sad. They were full of a deep, quiet reverence she had never seen before. He did not touch her face. He moved his hand, his rough, calloused, scarred hand, and laid it gently on her flat stomach, over the coarse wool of her dress. His touch was warm. "Clara," he said, his voice thick, "look at me." She met his gaze. "You are carrying," he whispered, his thumb moving in a slow, gentle circle, "something no man can ever buy." The words hit her. A blow that knocked the air from her lungs. Bought, traded, property. He saw her shock, and he pulled her closer, his other arm coming around her shoulders. "This is not a trap," he said, his voice fierce, low. This is ours. This is not your father's house. This is not Silas Croft's shack." He held her, his hand still possessive, protective, on her belly. "You are not your mother. You are not her, and I am not him." She clung to him, her fear warring with the hope his words sparked. "She was so alone." She sobbed into his shirt. "You are not alone," he said, his voice a low, iron promise. "You will never be alone again. This child will be loved. Clara, Not sold, not traded, loved. He held her, and she felt the truth of his words. This was not a chain. This was an anchor. This was the foundation for the cabin they had only spoken of. It was real. They found their spot the next day. A small meadow, sheltered from the wind, with a fast-running creek and a stand of tall pines that would be their walls. They began work. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. The ground was hard, the air was thin. Eli, his strength mostly returned, swung the axe, the clean, sharp thwack echoing in the cold air. Clara, heavy or not, would not be still. She helped him. She limbed the fallen trees, dragging the branches. She hauled rocks from the creek bed for the fireplace, her hands blistering, then callousing. The land was hard, but they were harder. They had been forged in a fire that made this cold wind feel like a minor inconvenience. They had been working for a week, a small, two-walled shelter built. When a rider approached, a man on a tall mule, a heavy rifle in his scabbard. Eli stepped in front of Clara, his own rifle in his hand. The man stopped, holding his hand up, palm out. "Easy, neighbor," he called. He was older, with a beard the color of frosted salt. "Name's Amos. I live over on the North Ridge. Saw your smoke." He looked at their half-built shelter. He looked at Eli. He looked at Clara, at the slight, unmistakable swell of her belly. He nodded, a slow, appraising look. "Tough work for two," he said. "We manage," Eli said, his voice neutral. "That you do." Amos spat a stream of tobacco. "But it'll be faster with 10. He turned his mule. "I'll be back, day after tomorrow. Bring some folks." He rode off. "Eli?" Clara asked. "We'll see," Eli said. 2 days later, they came. Amos returned with 3 wagons. There were 4 other men, and their wives, and a pack of children. They brought food, hot stew, fresh bread. They brought tools. They brought strong arms. "It's a raising," Amos's wife, Martha, said. She was a tall, sturdy woman with kind eyes. She took in Clara, the men's clothes, the pistol at her hip, the visible pregnancy. She did not whisper. She smiled. "You must be starved. Let's get you fed. The men will have this up before sundown." And they did. The women fed them, and the men worked. They were a force. They laughed. They shouted. They sweated. They were rough, kind, and loud. Eli, quiet and watchful, worked alongside them. They saw his scars, his quiet competence, and they respected him. Clara sat with the women, and they did not ask where she came from. They asked what she needed. They talked of childbirth and long winters, and which herbs were best for colic. By sundown, the cabin was built, the walls were up, the roof was on. It was a solid 3-room box of fresh, raw pine. Clara wept. She stood in the doorway, her hand on her belly, and she cried. Martha put an arm around her. "It's a good house, child," she said. "It'll keep you warm." They were not outcasts. They were neighbors. Winter came on hard and fast, burying the world in a deep, silent white. But the cabin was warm. The stone fireplace Eli had built drew perfectly. The glass window he had traded for in town, a tiny settlement called Hope's Rest, looked out on a world of white and blue. They settled in. Eli tended the horses, built furniture, a solid table, 2 chairs, a sturdy cradle, carved from the same pine as the birds he had given her. Clara's body changed. She grew heavy. She felt the child move, a flutter, then a kick. It was not a trap. It was a miracle. As the snows deepened, she found her own place. She went with Eli into Hope's Rest. It was a single street with a mercantile, a smithy, and a saloon. She saw the children, running wild. She found the smith, his wife. "I can read," Clara said, "and write. I can teach your children, if you'll have me." The smith's wife looked at this young, pregnant woman. "We ain't got money for a teacher." "I don't want money," Clara said. "I want to help. I want the girls. I want them to know how to read." A classroom was started in the back of the mercantile. Twice a week, Clara would ride in, and she would teach. She taught them sums and letters. She read to them, and she saw in the girl's eyes a hunger she recognized, a hunger to be seen. The winter broke. The heavy snows melted, the creek roaring with a thaw. The world turned from white to a soft, muddy green. On the first truly warm day of spring, Clara woke with a sharp, low pain. It had begun. It was long. It was hard. The girl who had begged her father, the woman who had faced a town, was now in the grip of a force older and more powerful than any of them. She was terrified, but Eli was there. He did not leave her side. He held her hand, the same hand he had held in the street in Lander. He wiped her face. He spoke to her, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of pain. "You're strong, Clara. You're the strongest person I know. You can do this. I'm right here." She bore down, clutching his hand, her body tearing, splitting, opening, and then a cry. A thin, sudden, furious wail. Eli was the one who wept. He cut the cord, and he laid the child, small and red and perfect, on Clara's chest. A girl. Clara laughed, a raw, exhausted sound. A girl. "Her name," Clara whispered, her eyes finding Eli's. "Her name is Grace." "Grace," he repeated. He leaned down and kissed Clara's sweaty forehead. Then he kissed his daughter. That night, a cold snap came in. A sudden, sharp spring blizzard began to fall, the wind howling around the eaves of their new, strong home. But inside, the fire was lit, Clara was clean, and she was propped up in their bed. Grace was asleep in the cradle Eli had carved, wrapped in a blanket Martha had given them. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, his hand holding hers. He was quiet, watching her, his face undone with a love so profound it was almost painful. Clara looked at him, at the man who had seen her at her lowest, who had pulled her back, who had just held her as she brought their child into the world. She looked at the fire, at the snow hissing against the glass of her new window. "I thought love was something bought and taken," she whispered. "Something you paid for, or something that was forced. I thought that was all it was." Eli looked at her, his eyes full of the firelight. He raised her hand to his lips. He kissed her knuckles. "No," he said, his voice rough. "Love is something you choose to give." He leaned in, his gaze holding hers. "And you," he whispered. "You gave it to me." He kissed her, a long, slow kiss of peace, of promise. The snow fell thick and silent outside. The fire burned bright inside, and the family, the man, the woman, and the child, a family no one had ever thought would survive, was warm, and they were finally home. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please comment below. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this. We look forward to reading your thoughts in English.